The King's Legacy, from a book of old-fashioned fairy tales and fables by Chuma Ikenzi. There was once an old king who sat on his throne and ruled. He had a crown with a warm pad on his head, and he wore felt slippers on his feet. He was just an old king who had to take it easy while governing. When he sat on his throne and ruled, he held his scepter in his right hand and the realm's orb in his left. But his was not a golden orb. Instead, it was a golden delicious apple. The real golden orb had become too heavy for the old king to carry. It also needed to be rubbed with flannel every day to maintain its shine, and that was too much trouble for the king. But he could eat the golden delicious apple orb. So the old king ate quite a lot of royal apples. When he sat ruling, he lived on apples, so to speak, but he spat out the seeds because he did not want apple trees sprouting from his head. The king's realm was not big, and neither was his castle, but his throne was set up nicely in the throne room. The castle also had a kitchen where the queen baked gingerbread every day. The gingerbreads baked by the old queen were the most beautiful in all the land. But she hadn't done so for a long time now because she had died. However, she left her gingerbread recipe and an equally beautiful princess as her legacy to the realm. It was sometimes hard to tell which of the two was more valued. Anyone who would think that the more beautiful of the two must have been the princess has, surely, never tasted the queen's gingerbread. And those who thought the gingerbread the more beautiful legacy had never seen a real fairy tale princess. The old king also wanted to leave the kingdom a great legacy, but he did not know what. So he stayed and continued to rule his subjects while dreaming of a suitable legacy. This kingdom was so small that it had only 2.5 subjects. But if you add the princess, there would then be 3.5 subjects in the kingdom, although one could argue that a princess should never be counted among the subjects. The subjects were the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Exterior, but both subjects were actually one person. When he stood with his feet pointing inwards, he was counted as the Minister of Interior, and when he stood with his feet pointing outwards, he counted as the Minister of Exterior. This arrangement was very clear and became the established order of the day. So, when he played the card game, Sheep's Head, with the old king, he would put his feet pointing inward, because that was an internal matter. The half of a subject lived on the border of another kingdom. So, to avert an international incidents, the two neighboring kings decided to claim only one half of the subject. There was also a cat in the kingdom, but the king and everyone knows that cats can't be ruled. This cat was friends with the princess and served as her de facto personal advisor. One day when the old king was sitting on his throne, ruling and eating his apple orb, the princess came to him and said, "Your Majesty Papa, I have decided that I'm going to marry." "Great news," said the king, "do that. But who are you thinking of marrying?" "I want to marry half of our subject," responded the princess. Upon hearing that, the old king dropped his half-eaten apple orb in shock. "That might suit you," he said, "but it will take away half of my subject from me, and I don't have many, as it were." Then he added, "I see this is only half a plan. But I've already thought about the internal and the external implication of my marriage, and I have discussed this with the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Exterior." Then she added, "I believe that the sum of the two plans makes my proposal a whole plan." The king then looked to his minister who had been standing quietly beside the throne. The minister quickly came to attention, pointing his feet inward, and confirmed his discussion as Minister of Interior with the internal part of the princess's proposal. Then he moved to the other side of the throne, pointed his feet outward, and confirmed, as Minister of Exterior, his discussion of the other half of the plan. Now the king had no choice but to accept that indeed the princess had developed a full plan with the input of his ministers of Interior and Exterior. While the king was still thinking of a response, the princess added, "Once I get married, I will try very hard to have many children, to increase the population of the kingdom." "I will be very happy about that," said the old king. "But if you have many children, they will all be princes and princesses. Who will they rule over? As it is now, we have only 2 whole subjects, because, as you know, we cannot count the cat among our subjects. And by this act you will have married half of the realm." "That does not matter," said the princess. "I have also given some thought to that. I plan to teach the children how to rule themselves." The old king remained silent and continued to eat his apple orb, which he had picked up from the floor. But the young princess had raised a question that he had always wondered about. What would a kingdom be like if everyone ruled themselves? That is, if everyone took responsibility for their actions and did not always wait for the king or some official to tell them what to do. He knew from experience how cumbersome it is to have the responsibility for ruling a kingdom, and he wondered if he should take the risk of giving the princess's suggestion a chance. So he turned to the princess and asked, "How do you plan to raise your children and half of my subject to be able to rule themselves?" "That is easy," the princess replied. "Each child will be raised to appreciate that they have a responsibility towards one another, and that true progress and peace can only reign where each person is able to control and rule their own emotions and needs." She continued, "Think, Your Majesty Papa. Have you ever asked me to bake gingerbread for you since Her Majesty Mama died?" The king nibbled a bit on the apple orb, while he reflected. "Coming to think of it, you are right. I have never had to ask, and I have also never lacked gingerbread." The princess continued, "Have you noticed that you have never had any issues with half of our subject, like with the payment of his taxes, abiding by the laws of the realm, or keeping his environment clean?" Again, the king had to admit to what the princess said. "Well then," concluded the princess, "half our subject and I have been ruling ourselves unnoticed by you all these years." The king had no choice but to agree again, and with that he now had greater confidence that indeed he could accept the princess's suggestion, and that he could rest assured that his realm would be populated with princes and princesses who would be able to rule themselves. With that decided, the king turned to his Minister of Interior to make the necessary internal arrangements for the wedding, which it was agreed will take place in 2.5 fortnights. The Minister of Exterior was also instructed to ensure that the appropriate wedding announcements were sent, with invitations, to the kings and dignitaries of the neighboring kingdoms. In time, the princess had children, just as she had promised. The children were all princes and princesses, just as she had promised. And since they had no subjects to rule, they learned to rule themselves, just as she had promised. And this was something that had never happened before in any other realm. Now the king could see that the princess was keeping all of her promises, and that he was right to have accepted her idea. Then it dawned on him that perhaps this was the legacy that he had been seeking to leave for his realm. The legacy of a realm where people exercised self-rule. He had been wanting to retire from ruling, and with this latest development he wondered if everyone was ruling themselves, whether there should be any need for an administration. And he even thought of relieving the ministers of their duties, since he could see no suitable role for them in a realm where everyone ruled themselves. Then, one day, a letter came from the neighboring kingdom, addressed to no one in particular. The neighboring king had heard that the old king was getting ready to retire, and that no replacement was planned for a new ruler. And that was why he addressed his letter to no one in particular. But the letter threw the realm into confusion, because no one was sure to whom it should be forwarded, since the of-state administration was in the process of being dismantled as irrelevant. Finally, what was left of the Minister of Exterior put half of his feet pointing out, and decided that since the letter came from outside the realm, it was an external matter. So he opened and read the letter to the king, who was half listening because he was already half removed from ruling. The subject of the letter was about the status of the half-subject, who technically was still being counted as part of the other realm's population. But now that he was married to a princess, the other king wanted to know the protocol for handling this delicate matter. As the king was still trying to grasp the nature of this international incident, the minister's feet involuntarily shifted, pointing inward, and the Minister of Interior emerged to mention that indeed this issue had its internal dimensions too. If half of the subject could no longer be classified as half a subject, would that make him a whole subject? And if so, would the marriage still be valid, since the princess had married half a subject? All of this was too much for the old king to think about. So, he called for the princess to discuss the matter with her. She listened carefully to the king, and when he finished she said, "This is a simple matter. Just because the people in a kingdom can rule themselves does not mean that the kingdom does not need an administration. Yes, our neighbor has raised a valid question. I suggest you leave its resolution to half our subject and myself. Of course, we will work with the ministers of internal and external affairs. And, oh, by the way, we would like to name the cat as our special privy counselor." Again, all of this was too much for the old king to deal with. All he wanted was to retire, eat royal apples, and play sheep's head. So, he gladly accepted the princess's suggestion to leave the matter to them to resolve. As the team left the throne room to go develop their response, the king contemplated the crucial lesson that he had learned, namely, that even the best laid plan has unforeseen elements. But he was glad that problem was no longer his concern. And he was especially happy that he had left behind a good legacy for his kingdom.